As I've mentioned previously, part of Titus's business model in the era of the Nintendo 64 was to purchase rights to franchises, which they felt they could secure for a cheap price and that the cost would outweigh the return on the games they could produce with said licenses. You only have to look at their history of games on the console to see their full lineup. Heck, I even did a whole video on Titus on Nintendo 64, which I'll link to in the description box, to see that whilst they didn't have those AAA red-hot licenses, they did some savvy business to secure some well-known IPs that would look good on store shelves. So brings us to today's review of Hercules: The Legendary Journeys. The TV show was filmed in New Zealand well before it became en vogue to do so after the Lord of the Rings movies were filmed there. The series ran for over 6 seasons and over 100 episodes, and was a staple on television across the globe due to its family-friendly Saturday afternoon style adventures. After the surprisingly good Xena Warrior Princess from Titus in 1999, I had high hopes when I heard that they had acquired the rights to Hercules and were producing a single-player adventure game in the style of Zelda for release the following year. They promised an action-packed brand new storyline for the game, the ability to play as many of the series' top characters, and settings, and it all sounded great on paper. Quick spoiler alert however, whilst the fairly decent Xena Warrior Princess had been published by Titus, it was actually developed by Sapphire. Thankfully, Superman 64 was the one which was developed in-house, and Hercules was outsourced to the studio Player One, who shouldn't be confused with the newer studio of the same name who specialise in iOS games. But I digress. Getting back to Hercules, it's fair to say that before its release, the gaming press weren't exactly anticipating the game that much. In N64 magazine in issue 33, they had a small preview where they described it as a platform/fighting game and gave it an anticipation rating of only 1 out of 5. Electronic Gaming Monthly were slightly kinder, however they too only devoted a small section of the magazine in issue 122 and again in issue 133 later that year. They reduced it even further with a mere paragraph about the game. In fact, across pretty much all gaming publications, it's fair to say that the preview information being leaked showed that they weren't really expecting much, and they were urging players to manage their expectations despite the obvious influences of Zelda on the game. Landing on store shelves in October of the year 2000, Hercules: The Legendary Journeys scrapped the suggested 4-player mode which had been one of the proposed features of the game, and instead brings you a pure single-player adventure spanning 12 worlds across ancient Greece, fantasy monsters from Greek mythology, and puzzles to solve to obtain artifacts which you'll need to defeat Ares. The game begins with the mysterious storyteller giving you the game's backstory combined with some static images on parchment-like paper. Sure, I would have liked the cutscenes to have been in real time and to show this, but for what the game is worth, it gives you just enough here to be able to jump in and play without dragging this section of the game out too much. In short, you're in a time where gods have a bit of a disdain towards humans, and they enjoy seeing their suffering. Zeus gets poisoned, and it's up to Hercules to take on his brother Ares to stop him seizing the throne from Zeus and taking control of the universe. Sensing that things are kicking off, many of the other gods descend upon the mortal realm to investigate what has caused this imbalance in the world. You take control of Hercules in the stables, and this area, I cannot stress enough, really needs to be played properly, because paying full attention here in this tutorial level is really important, because at first glance it does appear to have a very Zelda-esque control and visual prompt system when you're playing, but if you don't focus in this training area you'll easily miss moves which you need to learn that you'll rely on heavily as the game progresses, so don't be tempted to rush through this to get into the main adventure. With your newfound skills in hand you can head out, and the first thing you'll probably notice is that many of the textures seem to be taken directly from Zelda. It's strange because at times the game feels very familiar to you, and a sense of deja vu can kick in, but this is quickly interrupted by the controls which fall far short of the refined ones found in this game's inspiration. When you get close to objects or items you can interact with, you'll get an on-screen prompt which can help those times when you're not quite sure if something is part of the scenery or if it's an actual integral part of the level. Being more hand-based combat centric than say Zelda means you have a wide range of buttons required for combat, and whilst the combat itself does get things quite right, it does become very repetitive, and it's somewhat nice to be able to have moves like blocks and combos to really mix things up. The camera however is very first generation, And whilst I have seen worse in games, it's hard that for a year 2000 game the studio clearly didn't learn from the mistakes that its predecessors had made, and we're left with a clunky camera system here which requires constant player manipulation to get it in that just right spot. This isn't helped by the fact that the levels themselves are honestly quite huge at times, and there's backtracking involved as well, and having to constantly shift the camera, it can cause you a great sense of confusion, even for those who feel that they have a great sense of direction. Another aspect I wasn't keen on were some of the environmental impacts on the characters. Picking up boulders in the game by hammering the A button becomes tedious, and if you have to do it whilst you're being swarmed by enemies, you'll take lots of needless damage. Likewise, when you go through water or a swampland, your character speed comes down to a snail's pace, and it makes these sections an absolute chore. You'll soon learn to dread seeing anything liquid because it's like moving through a tar pit. So far I've touched on the levels and combat, but being an adventure game it's fair to say there's some side quests which have some more RPG-like elements. Throughout the game you'll be tasked with speaking to people, the occasional fetch quest, as well as those that see you delivering items to other parts of the realm. Whilst for the first half of the game these were used sparingly, in the later stages they become more common, and I can't help but feel that these were ushered into the game to increase its length artificially when they realised the game could be beaten fairly quickly. The character interactions were clearly an afterthought. Whilst games that have NPCs to interact with often put them in to help you get clues to solve puzzles or advice on what to do next, Hercules has its characters offer little more than some light comedic relief, and even calling it comedy is a tad stretching the truth. In reality, there's little need to actually speak to anyone, and so it's really scraping it when it calls itself an adventure game because it does the bare minimum to do so. It's not all doom and gloom in Hercules however, the visuals for one thing are surprisingly good. I mean they're really nice when you consider that the game doesn't use the expansion pack, and the frame rate is pretty much locked in even if there's a load of enemies after your blood on screen. Whilst the levels are large and many textures as mentioned aren't quite unique here, there are many areas in the game where you feel the studio could have easily reduced the level size to create something a bit more bespoke to the game. When you consider that the game doesn't really utilise any lighting effects and isn't really pushing the console near its limits, it feels like the studio played it safe and were working on a very tight budget which Titus expected. You could argue that from the game to look this good and play the way it does whilst Titus were pulling the purse strings is an amazing achievement in its own right. I'll also give credit for some of the scenery which sees the levels take place across a nice range of environments from grasslands to beaches, and even a castle setting amongst others. I actually also enjoyed the sound design and effects in the game too. Yes, it's slightly low quality, almost MIDI-like tunes, but for what it is here it fits the game's fantasy style setting quite nicely, and the stereo sound has some good decent separation. So if you're playing on a nice sound setup or with some headphones, you can often tell where enemies are going to be coming from. The audio effects too are decent enough, and with plenty of environmental objects like fire, water, explosions, rock smashes and brawling, they all sound fitting of the style of the game and have enough depth to add a sense of realism to the on-screen action. My personal favourite part of the game though are the boss battles. Given the source material, it's no surprise that you come up against some pretty epic bosses ripped straight from Greek mythology, and they don't disappoint. Whilst the AI of the bosses at times can be lacking, the clever patterns needed to take them out makes each encounter feel fresh and worthy. And finally, the addition of the extra playable characters at different parts of the game does spice things up a bit, although they do feel quite forced into the game rather than being carefully woven into the storyline. What they do add is new abilities, and it changes the gameplay up at the right times and gives you a different way to think when tackling the game's puzzles, albeit they are all fairly easy to begin with. Despite the game's flaws, there's actually a surprisingly good amount to like about Hercules. Look, it's not Zelda, Mystical Ninja or even Indiana Jones, but what Hercules tries to do by creating a solid adventure on a tight budget and at a cheap retail price when it was released meant that it kind of ticks all the boxes in a strange way. It won't end up on anybody's favourite games list, but if you're a fan of the TV show you'll probably really enjoy this more than others, and even if like me you really weren't taken by the TV show, then there's still enough here to get stuck into to kill a weekend with your first playthrough. So for today's topic of conversation, I'd love to know what TV show from the late 90s or even the early 2000s you'd have loved to have become an N64 game. For me, I personally would have liked to have seen a full-on horror-style Goosebumps game, maybe even in the light of a point-and-click adventure genre, which is one of my favourite game styles. As always though, let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below, and until next time.